Welcome to episode 4 of the Spirals of Inquiry training. And this episode takes us through the last two stages of the spiral process, that of taking action and of checking. My name is Ian Smiley and I'm going to be your guide for those stages as we go through the next two stages together. And we're going to start with taking action. And taking action kind of asks us really a subsidiary question, which is what can we do differently to make enough of a difference? So it follows from the learning stage that we've looked at previously, and it takes that learning that we were able to do in that stage and in a sense gives us an opportunity to use an informed reasoned action or a kind of evidence base to help us to think about what action that we need to take next. And let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. So taking action, I suppose, might be the step of the spiral that has been the most long awaited. It's often, as human beings, the place that we want to get to very quickly. We're often very keen to think, okay, so let's move into what are we going to do about this? Let's move into a taking action stage. It's important actually that we don't jump to this stage too prematurely in the process and miss out other parts of the stages or not spend enough time in those stages prior to the taking action phase. We should be sure we have thoroughly taken full part in the learning before we begin to plan our actions, so that our actions are informed by the learning that's taken place in the previous stage. So this phase is about taking informed actions that will make enough of a difference in terms of our whole school approach to wellbeing in our school communities. It's the time to put new ideas that we've learned into informed, focused and community-led action. We must first consider what we can do to make the difference, then plan it and do it, try it out if you like, ensuring that we measure the progress as we go. So kind of evaluating and getting feedback is also a big part of this stage. We also need to ensure that the whole school community are involved in this action that we take. The community should know why we are trying this new idea and how it can look here. It's an exciting opportunity to try out the ideas which have emerged from the previous stages. We can have a go to find out if our actions create useful and meaningful change in order to improve well-being for our school community. The action should be something that we are well informed about, that has arisen via the entire spiral process. So again, that coherence of leading into the action being connected to the previous stages of the spiral. We should be aware, I suppose, as well, that some team members might have worries or concerns about trying out a new approach. So we should voice these or kind of create the spaces for us to talk about these as a team and as a community, and encourage people to take the opportunity without fear of failure. Working on the principle that sometimes things won't work out as we planned, or that making mistakes is part of the greater learning that is a part of the spiral. So creating that kind of judgment-free environment where mistakes are expected, accepted and seen as a learning opportunity is really important at this stage of the process. We should recognise that we might need several attempts at the new action to create enough evidence to evaluate the new approach in the checking phase that follows. And this will require kind of decisive and intentional action around kind of activities of planning, doing, checking and reflecting as we go. So all the way through the spiral so far, we've looked at this very helpful table which tells us a little bit about what taking action is at this stage of the spiral and what taking action is not. So the taking action stage is about learning deeply. So it's all the details of new ways of doing things that have emerged from the spiral process, then taking action to try them out. It's about making changes and testing things out, so seeing how it fits and seeing what needs to be adapted or tweaked to fit for the way that we live and work in our school community. It's about evaluating the impact the changes have on the school community and seeking feedback from all members of the community and finding ways to do that. It's about being aware that change is difficult and can feel risky, but using a growth mindset to learn from failure as we go through the process. So let's have a think about what taking action isn't. Taking action is not trying something without considering its value or relevance for the situation. So again, that reminds us of the need for the coherence to the process, to the spiral of inquiry process that we've taken thus far. Taking action isn't about assuming that everyone is comfortable with the changes and that they'll be happy to share their findings if their actions fail to receive the desired results. Taking action isn't about failing to monitor the effects of the changes on school communities, and it certainly isn't about kind of trying things out, failing, then giving up on the idea as unsuccessful. Taking action really does encourage us to say, what are we learning from this failure, this thing not working out here, and how can we adapt, change, or rethink that to really fit in this taking action phase. So how do we do taking action? It isn't just about implementing new strategies. It's deeper than that. By taking action, we are deepening our learning that began in the previous stage of the learning phase of the spiral. It isn't until we try the new learning out that we discover what these really mean for our school community. So what these ideas really start to mean, how they connect with our school community. Many of us by nature as human beings are action-orientated people. We see a problem and we want to try and fix it. At this point in the process, many staff who work in schools may already be trying out new actions. This is appropriate when the change is fairly straightforward, but when it is more complex, when it's a bit more messy, and things often are when we look below the surface, it can be important to slow down in order to speed up. Taking action needs to be a team sport rather than solo activity. So it's about who needs to be involved in this taking action, whatever that might be, in our school community. Whole school approaches to wellbeing are most effective when all members of the community are involved. There need to be opportunities for everyone to get ideas from one another and to allow those to grow and develop. You may have a team, for example, working on this particular spiral, but that team might want to consult with other members of the community as to what their ideas might be for taking action when they hear about what you've learned. We may not always get these right first time. I think that's really important to say. The learning through the spiral continues. The taking action phase is part of new learning and is not just the doing. At this stage, there needs to be opportunities for dialogue, for observation, for reflection, and for second and third tries if necessary, so that we're learning and developing as we go through this stage of taking action rather than just the doing. At this stage, we need to remind ourselves of one of the key questions that sits on the spiral diagram. How do we know? It's one of the three big questions that we spoke about at the beginning of this training package. How do we know if what we are doing for our community in the taking action phase in terms of wellbeing is making a difference? To answer this usually requires some kind of record of practice. Observations, wellbeing walks, meetings with members of the school community or different groups. Answering the first question, how do we know what is happening for the members of our community in terms of this, means asking them and seeing how those things are now working differently, or how our communities are being differently in respect of something like belonging, for example. Kaiser and Halbert and Timperley, as we've looked at in this spiral inquiry meeting, they share an example of an Australian secondary school that gets together regularly to celebrate intelligent risk taking within their organisation by describing their flop of the week. There is so much to learn from a frank appraisal of what doesn't work, perhaps more so sometimes than what worked flawlessly and first time. So we return to the vignette, and again, before we ask you to pause and just have a think about this stage of the vignette, we need an update from what happened in the vignette in the learning phase. So in the learning phase, you and members of your Spiral team decided to begin by looking at the research to help to inform the next phase of taking action. You conducted a search of the current literature around the importance of belonging in school communities and consulted with other external agencies for further information. You discovered that a sense of belonging is important to promote well-being in the school community. Feeling truly connected to your school community, where you have meaningful relationships with others and feeling as though you are part of something. Also, in your research into staff well-being, you discovered that a sense of agency, of having a voice and of feeling valued, is a really important contributor. So given that we're in the taking action phase, and given that that's what was learnt in the learning phase, what might you try to do differently as a result? Now would be the time to pause the training and to reflect on that and have a think about what you would be trying to do differently in the taking action phase and what kind of learning you think would take place in addition to that. Okay, so when we did this taking action stage as part of the live training, we asked groups to go into clusters. So our attendees from different schools went into groups that were other schools from their cluster were together, and they thought about that stage of the vignette. They'd also taken part in all of the other stages of the process so far. And this was some of the feedback that we received from that taking action activity. So one group thought that flexibility is an action, that they needed to look at different ways of communicating. Not one way can fit all, and communication to all can be one of the hardest things to achieve. Another group reflected that you would also further embed what has worked for your school so it becomes good practice and not a bolt-on. So again, coming back to that idea that we've looked at through this training of the need for a coherence through the process of the spiral of inquiry, so that the things that you are taking action for, or the things that you end up taking action on rather, are things that have come through the process of the spiral itself. Another group mentioned that they were looking at additional means on top of parents' evening to break down the perceived disconnectedness between school and parents. They would also look at a means to regularly capture staff and student voice and how that could lead into improvement planning. So those questions, those bits of feedback arose from the questions that we asked the groups when they returned to the main training. And the questions were, what actions informed by the process of the spiral of inquiry would you be trying out in this taking action phase? How did you decide what these would need to look like? And what are your thoughts about the taking action phase? What might it look like in your school? What would be the opportunities and what could be the barriers that you would need to bear in mind? And hopefully in your own thinking around the vignette, you'll have some thoughts around some of those feedback questions for yourself at this stage. Okay, and that takes us onwards into the final stage of the spiral of inquiry, the checking stage. And the sub kind of question here for us, which provides a steer through the stage itself, is have we made enough of a difference? So that helps us to consider what this stage of checking will involve for us. So checking is the final part of the spiral before spiraling back around to scanning again. So we mentioned at the beginning of the day that the spiral of inquiry keeps going in that spiral way of kind of moving, once we get to the end of a process, moving through back into scanning and around the process again. And of course the implication of that is we never do fully achieve a whole school approach to wellbeing as a completed task. We're constantly learning and developing as we go, and in line with how our communities, the needs of our school communities, change, grow and develop over time. So checking really, one of the important principles of the checking phase is that it shouldn't just be seen as a part of the ending routine of the spiral process. We need to be sure in this phase that the action has made enough of a difference to the whole school community, and we should be able to prove this with evidence. It's really important not to simply try to justify what has to be done. The implication, justify what has been done. And of course, the implication of that is we need to stay open to what information that we find out, even if it's not the information that we hoped for in this check-in phase. So we need to be honest and considered about whether the action has actually made enough of a difference. And of course, if we're finding that it's not, that does take us back into a scanning phase of the spiral and further through the stages once again to help us to make more sense of that. So we return to this very helpful table where we look at what the stage is and what it isn't. And in the checking phase, the final stage of the spiral, checking is knowing what you want to accomplish for your learners or for the members of your school community, including your staff and your families, and using specific ways to measure the success of this from early in the spiral process. So checking is also being measured and considering if change is significant for all students, staff and families. Checking is acknowledging what is still uncertain, what we may have learned from our failures as we've gone, and what has been lost and gained. Checking is setting high expectations for your actions that will make a substantial difference for all of the members of your school community. And checking is celebrating the learning that has happened through the spiral process as a school community. And of course, checking, because it is at this stage of the spiral process, it sets the stage for what comes next and for that continual journey of learning and development in relation to well-being. So checking isn't just a routine to follow at the end of the process. It's as important as any of the other stages. It's not seeking a small change for some members of the community or assuming that any positive change is enough of a change. It's not judging the capacity of members of the community to succeed. And it's certainly not a way to just justify the actions that you've taken so far. We've already mentioned holding an openness to the process, but also an openness to the information that can come out and be fed back to you as a result of the check-in stage. So how do we do checking? What are the actions in our checking stage? So checking looks like where we begin with the importance of taking the time to celebrate what has been learned within your community. We might, for example, consider sharing the story of how the spiral has progressed, what we have learned, including failures and successes, and any uncertainties or new possibilities that have arisen. With the whole school community, perhaps through an assembly, an evening event, an open afternoon for members of the wider community, parents and professional colleagues to come along to. But the key question is we need to ask whether we have made enough of a difference. Have we made a difference for the whole school community? And how do we know? Is it a measurable change? And what are we seeing that tells us that? We should be able to show the results using things like outcome measures, but we can also refer back to those three key guiding questions that we've revisited as we've gone through the Spiral of Inquiry training together. One of the key things is involving all members of the community in the checking process where we can. So if we're really going to achieve a full picture of how much difference is being made, we need those voices being facilitated through this process. Professionals, for example, professionals' observations and perceptions are an important piece of the puzzle. So as members of school staff, you'll have a sense of how things are going and what you've noticed and what you've observed as you've moved around the school and as you've met different members of the community. So they're an important piece of the puzzle, but we need to hold in mind that they probably do not tell the whole story. So for us, the question is, how do we access the whole story? How do we get that from other members of our community? How do we find creative, engaging ways to build this whole story around how has this process gone and what have we learned from it? Another key consideration is what evidence will we use to determine whether or not our actions are making enough of a difference? So there's some key principles as represented in this table. Keeping collecting evidence as we have been doing, looking at the data, all kinds of data, and hopefully a range of data that will come out of the process, and checking that our findings are accurate. So maybe going back and checking with and alongside members of our school community and collecting the feedback from the whole school community. And then of course taking the time to celebrate the full circle of one whole spiral, the learning and quite possibly the change that has occurred from that, and the achievement of that for the whole school community. What do you notice that tells you that something different is now happening here? The whole process of the spiral of inquiry really is built to encourage professional curiosity and to create new learning. So we work really hard to avoid any blame or shame when we might naturally form or come into conversation when we come across failures. We go back to this idea that as a school community, we are a team. As a team working on the spiral, that we are a team, and we hold a growth mindset as we move through the spiral process. We might think together about ways that we can make it feel safer to share what we have learned, perhaps by highlighting that we can learn from failure, or maybe encouraging people to share things that haven't worked before they share the successes. And of course, one of the things that we know from psychological research around children's learning and development, for example, is that when children are encouraged to think about making mistakes and experiencing failure as part of a wider learning and pathway to development, that actually that really promotes the way that they approach challenge and learning activity. So there are benefits that will pervade through the school community of taking that kind of approach. And so to the end of our spiral, and yet back to the beginning. Back to the beginning, the quote that we presented at the beginning of the day from Timperley et al., which says, "Innovation floats on a sea of inquiry, and curiosity is the driver for change." The spiral of inquiry, it's hoped, creates innovation, where school communities create new approaches that are fundamentally different from the way things were done before. The changes are based upon a rich understanding of what's going on for a school community. They come from a place of values, the values that you hold, and those continue up through the stages of the spiral, so that you end up with a coherence to what you do, where the actions that you take as a result of the spiral work that you've done feel really connected to what your community needs. The framework, of course, is a spiral because one inquiry tends to lead into another. And this lovely notion of a sea of inquiry in this quote refers to the possibility of ideas and practices rippling outwards through your school community. We rescan, we refocus, and we continue on this voyage of learning and change and development of a whole school approach to wellbeing. In a school community, often a curiosity as a culture, if you like, becomes contagious, and inquiry mindsets are really infectious. Inquiry is not a project or initiative, it is a professional way of being.